Billionaire, monster, secret. Every Tuesday night, staff at the Gilded Spoon whispered his name like a curse. Alistair Blackwood, the titan of logistics, a man whose fortune seemed limitless and whose temper was legendary. Tuesday was not a day, it was a storm. No one wanted his table, no one wanted the test. The servers would fake illness, managers would shuffle schedules, the kitchen would hold its breath. Because every Tuesday, the monster arrived to remind the world that money could bend reality to his will. But this Tuesday was different. Julian Hart was 24, fresh in his uniform, still smoothing the creases with trembling hands. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not under the monster's gaze. He had only taken the job because the hospital bills for his mother piled higher than his savings, and his younger brother's tuition deadline hung like a noose. He told himself he could endure anything for them, even Blackwood. And Blackwood's rules were absurd. A steak ordered medium rare but leaning toward rare, lemon slices that must always come in 3, vegetables that could not touch the seafood, not even a single pea. Lighting adjusted to the precise percentage only he understood. Noise was to be controlled. Children moved to other rooms, eyes kept down, words measured or silenced altogether. The instructions from the manager were clear. Do not engage. Do not look him in the eye. Become invisible. Julian was not invisible. He was gay. He was proud. And though he respected authority, he had lived too long under the weight of dismissal to bow without reason. He had built his life on straight posture and steady tone. And when Blackwood sneered at the restaurant's standards, ridiculing their attempts to please, Julian's resolve cracked the silence. The only thing slipping tonight, he said evenly, is the butter on your bread. Every glass in the dining room seemed to freeze mid-sip. Every fork hung in the air. The orchestra of clinking cutlery and hushed conversations dissolved into a single suspended breath. Staff braced for disaster. The monster had been challenged. But Blackwood did not roar. He leaned back, eyes sharp as glass, and gave the smallest nod. He ordered his meal without a list of impossible demands. He examined each detail as if searching for imperfection. At the end of the night, he left a tip so large it could pay a month's rent, with a note that read only for the trouble. Julian did not feel victorious. He did not celebrate. He walked home through the city lights with the weight of unease pressing against his chest. It was not generosity that unsettled him, nor was it anger. It was the feeling that he had stepped onto a stage, that Blackwood had pulled him into a private theater where meals were not meals, but rituals of control, and every player had a role to perform. He thought of his mother lying in a hospital bed, of his brother studying in the cramped apartment they shared, of the bills waiting in a stack on his desk. He told himself it did not matter. He had survived Tuesday. He had faced the monster, but he could not shake the suspicion that this was only the first act of a play he had never agreed to join. Sometimes, the bravest choice is not to fight with fists or shout with rage. Sometimes, it is to stand without flinching, to speak a single steady sentence in the face of power. That night, Julian learned that resilience begins quietly, with the decision not to bow. If this story speaks to you, leave a comment with the word justice and subscribe to Heart Story, where true resilience, shocking twist, and hidden truths find their voice. The pattern continued. Every Tuesday, Alistair Blackwood arrived at the Gilded Spoon, and every Tuesday, Julian Hart braced himself for the strange theater of commands. What once felt like cruelty now revealed a system, a code hidden behind eccentric words. Where others saw madness, Julian began to notice logic. The light is aggressive, Blackwood would say. Staff panicked, unsure what that meant. Julian quietly adjusted the dimmer by 5%, and the storm passed. Too much noise, Blackwood muttered one evening, and Julian moved a family with small children to a quieter corner. The monster's language was harsh, but Julian translated it into balance, discipline, survival. For the other servers, Tuesdays were a nightmare. For Julian, they became an exercise in focus, a way of turning chaos into order. Yet order outside the restaurant was slipping through his hands. His phone buzzed one rainy evening during a shift. It was his younger brother, his voice trembling with fear. Their mother's oncologist had proposed a new treatment plan, experimental, not covered by insurance. The cost, $40,000. The insurance company had refused, labeling it unproven. Julian pressed the phone tighter, trying to absorb the panic of a family that depended on him. While balancing trays and wine glasses in the dim hallway of the restaurant, he thought he had hidden his despair. But when he turned, Alistair Blackwood was standing a few steps away, his expression unreadable. He had heard the entire conversation. Julian's chest filled with dread. Would this cost him his position? Would the billionaire dismiss him as weak, as distracted? Yet Blackwood said nothing. No reprimand, no judgment. He simply turned away, leaving Julian stranded in silence, carrying both shame and relief. 2 days later, a call came that Julian did not expect. A prestigious law firm, one of the most expensive in the country, informed him that an anonymous benefactor had decided to fund his family's legal fight against the insurance company. They would challenge the denial, comb through medical codes, expose loopholes and errors. At the same time, whispers reached Julian of scholarships quietly appearing for overworked public defenders and foundations sponsoring new legislation named Olivia Lillian laws designed to punish drunk drivers more severely, carrying the names of Blackwood's late wife and daughter. The pieces connected. The so-called monster who terrorized restaurants with impossible demands was also the unseen force funding justice in silence. His sharp tongue was a mask. His money was a weapon, not to humiliate, but to dismantle systems that had failed him, that had stolen everything from him. Blackwood was fighting battles no one else even knew existed. Julian felt the ground shift beneath him. The man everyone feared was not merely cruel. He was building invisible lifelines for strangers who would never know his name. But why cloak generosity and bitterness? Why use cruelty as a shield? Those questions lingered as Julian returned to work, trying to make sense of the contradictions. In that moment, one lesson became clear. Sometimes, kindness does not arrive with open arms or gentle smiles. Sometimes it comes hidden in silence, delivered through shadows, wrapped in bitterness that conceals unbearable grief. Julian realized the world's cruelties are often masks, and behind them can be pain, can be loss, and sometimes can even be compassion disguised as fury. The next Tuesday did not feel like a battlefield. For Julian Hart, it felt like the moment before a wall collapses, when a single fracture runs silently across stone. He had begun to see Alistair Blackwood differently. The eccentric demands no longer seemed like punishments. They resembled rituals, ways for a grieving man to impose order on a world that had once stolen all order from him. As Julian carried a tray toward table 7, he caught himself studying the billionaire with sharper eyes. Beneath the tailored suit, beneath the cutting words, there was a man who had built cages out of rules, cages to keep his grief contained. When Blackwood muttered about wine temperature or cutlery placement, Julian no longer heard tyranny. He heard a desperate attempt to rewrite chaos into precision. That evening, instead of bracing for another test, Julian spoke gently as he placed the glass on the table. He spoke not about food or service, but about those who fought quietly for victims no one else remembered. His words were careful, respectful, but carried the weight of lived truth. There are people, he said softly, who fight for the unseen, who stand even when no one notices. The restaurant seemed to fall silent, as if the chandeliers themselves leaned closer to hear. Blackwood did not interrupt. He did not sneer. He looked at Julian for a long, heavy moment, then gave an instruction that startled every member of staff within earshot. He ordered the dish exactly as the chef prepared it, without adjustments, without control. It was the first time anyone had seen him release the reins. From that night forward, subtle shifts occurred. Blackwood asked for recommendations on wine, then followed them without correction. He allowed dishes to arrive as they were intended. The theater of power had paused, replaced by a cautious trust in a single waiter who had refused to bow. Days later, news broke that the lawsuit had succeeded. The insurance company was forced to cover Julian's mother's treatment, opening a path to the therapy that once seemed impossible. Julian returned to table 7 that evening, his chest heavy with gratitude, his resolve steady. He looked at Blackwood and spoke plainly. "I know it was you." The billionaire did not deny it. He set his glass down with care and admitted in his own way that the armor of cruelty was a shield. His reputation as a tyrant kept the world at a distance, protecting scars that never fully closed. He revealed little, but he offered something greater. He invited Julian to step beyond the dining room, to leave behind the service trays and enter a different kind of work, the foundation that bore his name. Though few knew it existed, the Blackwood Foundation, an intricate network of hidden funds and secret grants, was a fortress against injustice. It fought battles the public never saw, from wrongful insurance denials to systemic neglect. Blackwood extended the offer with rare seriousness, become the architect, the one to guide these lifelines into a future that demanded courage. Julian accepted. A young gay man who had once been underestimated, dismissed as ordinary, was suddenly entrusted with building an empire of justice. He left the restaurant floor not as a servant, but as a leader walking into the unknown. That night, Julian learned that sometimes the first step toward change is not a dramatic rebellion, but a quiet lowering of flags. To release control is an act of trust, and to accept that trust is an act of responsibility. Both men had shifted. Both men had lowered a wall. And with that, the stage was set for truth far more painful than either had yet faced. The work inside the Blackwood Foundation was unlike anything Julian Hart had imagined. No longer bound to a dining room, he was buried in files, testimonies, and case histories that painted a map of injustice across the country. He moved between stacks of medical records, insurance appeals, and drunk driving reports, each one carrying the weight of lives dismantled by neglect or cruelty. At first, the intensity gave him purpose. He found a rhythm in uncovering the small details that could tip a case toward justice. He traced patterns, identified errors, and pieced together hidden truths with the discipline he had once used to decode Alistair Blackwood's cryptic demands at the restaurant. But the deeper he dug, the closer he came to a truth that did not belong to strangers, it belonged to him. The file appeared ordinary at first, a set of legal transcripts tied to the Olivia Lillian Initiative, the Foundation's flagship project on punishing drunk drivers. Julian opened it the way he had opened hundreds before, but his eyes froze on a name etched across the faded ink, a name that had haunted his childhood, even when spoken softly. His father, the man who had abandoned him, who had turned away when Julian came out as gay, who had left scars of rejection that never truly healed. The details in the file carved themselves into his chest: a drunk driving incident, a late-night crash, a wife and daughter killed instantly, a wealthy defense attorney exploiting loopholes, manipulating technicalities until the driver walked free with a reduced sentence. The dates aligned with the tragedy that had defined Blackwood's life. The location matched the story whispered across newspapers years ago, and the name, his father's name, made denial impossible. Julian's hands trembled as he flipping through the pages. The ink blurred as his eyes filled with disbelief. His own father, the man who had cast him aside, was the reason Blackwood's world had been destroyed. Every opportunity, Julian's family now had the insurance victory, his mother's new treatment. His own role in the foundation was bound to a grief born from his father's crime. He wrote a letter that night, the words spilling like confession. He could not face Blackwood with silence. He admitted what he had discovered, admitted the connection that bound their lives through blood and tragedy. He did not plead for mercy. He did not defend his father. He only asked to accept whatever judgment might come, whether dismissal, rejection, or severance. Julian prepared himself to bear the weight. On Tuesday evening, he placed the envelope on table 7, the same place where their strange journey had begun. As Blackwood unfolded the letter, the restaurant lights seemed dimmer, the air heavier. Julian stood before him stripped of all defenses, no longer the confident waiter or the rising advocate, but a son burdened with shame that was not his own making. The silence stretched long. It was the silence of graves. of losses that could not be undone. Yet Julian stood there because he believed truth mattered more than comfort. He believed carrying the burden openly was the only way forward. In that moment, one truth glowed beneath the pain: family is not only the blood that binds us, but also the choices we inherit. Some inherit privilege, others inherit wounds. Julian had inherited a wound, and though he could not heal what his father had destroyed, he could decide what to do with that inheritance. Sometimes, the most terrifying act of courage is not to expose someone else's failure, but to reveal the shadow cast by your own bloodline. And in choosing honesty, Julian stepped closer to freedom, even if it meant losing everything he had just begun to build. Alistair Blackwood did not rush. He unfolded the letter slowly, eyes tracing every line as if each word carried the weight of the years he had lost. The dining room around them dissolved into a blur. For Julian Hart, every second felt like a blade. He expected fury, rejection, the severing of the fragile bridge they had built. Instead, when Blackwood finally looked up, his gaze was steady, not sharpened with anger, but softened by something heavier: understanding. "You are not your father," he said, his voice quiet yet unshakable. "His sins are not your inheritance." The words cut deeper than any condemnation could have, because they offered freedom where Julian had only expected chains. Blackwood did not demand separation, nor did he close the door on what they had begun. Instead, he proposed a new condition, one that demanded courage not only from Julian, but from them both. The Olivia Lillian Initiative would expand. A new branch, called Sober Roads, would be created under the Foundation's network. It would not only advocate for harsher penalties against drunk driving, but also fund rehabilitation programs, scholarships for survivors, and campaigns to dismantle the culture that excused recklessness. Blackwood wanted Julian at the center of it, not as a token, not as a silent executor, but as the visible voice of a mission born from tragedy. And there was more. Blackwood outlined a vision where the Foundation would prioritize victims often left behind, those rejected, abandoned, or dismissed, particularly within the LGBTQ+ community. Files that once slipped through cracks would be gathered, reviewed, and fought for. Julian's role was no longer hidden. He would appear publicly, telling his story not as a confession of guilt, but as proof that even the darkest inheritance could be turned into protection for others. Julian listened, heart pounding with the realization that this was not punishment, but a test of integrity. He could walk away, bury the truth, and try to live quietly. Or he could step forward, risk exposure, and use the pain of his bloodline to shield others from the same fate. He chose to remain, not because his father deserved redemption, but because victims deserve justice that grew from the soil of honesty. That night, Table 7 no longer felt like a theater of cruelty. It became the birthplace of an unlikely alliance, a billionaire who learned to shed his armor, and a young gay man who transformed inherited shame into a vow of protection. Together, they began weaving justice out of grief, teaching that the past cannot be rewritten, but it can be redefined. Julian walked away with a truth carved into him. Hatred can consume generations, but justice can rebuild them. To choose justice is not to forgive betrayal, it is to refuse to let betrayal write the final chapter. And now I want to hear from you. If you were Julian, would you have stayed to build that foundation of justice? Or would you have walked away to protect yourself from a painful legacy? Comment your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Heart Stories for more tales of resilience, shocking twists, and the power of truth.